This tweet right here was a eureka moment for me. One of those instances where a thought you've already had, but never quite coalesced, finally and suddenly formed. There cannot be any coexistence with these people, with the tourists invading countless franchises. For the simple reason that our worldviews are just simply 100% anathema to one another. Completely opposed, utterly impossible to mix. Our worldviews are so far separate that our aesthetic tastes are quite literally guts and glory contra gay race orgies. Which finally clicked the last piece into place for me. Gatekeep, yes. Resist where possible, absolutely. Mock and point fingers at D&D in the hope to shame them into doing better, for sure. But most important of all is the realization that there is no integration here. There are no compromises that can be made, no agreements that can be struck. There is only definitionally absolute surrender or absolute rejection. A perhaps pinch pessimistic and yet also eminently realistic take that I will now go on to elaborate on, but many do indeed disagree with my doomsday take. Better, more hopeful people than me point out that our imagination yet remains. So the fact that D&D has become flowers and rainbows and endless gay couples and happy beholders does not mean that someone else cannot imagine themselves on an adventure to slay a dragon. And this is, of course, true. You are still free to walk up into the forest, pick up a stick, and brandish it at a particularly large rock, and declare it to be a troll. But this was not an ability granted to you by D&D. It might have been an inspiration for sure, but we can all imagine things, and we all did. Countless adventures were written for D&D, everything from comedy to horror, from fantasy to post-apocalypse, from the light and hopeful to the grim and dark. But then, even as everyone else were writing everything beneath the sun, a new kind of person arrived. And they too could simply have imagined. They could, in the privacy of their own homes and tables, have dreamt up the gayest adventures ever made. Indeed, they could even have released them, and were they to be put up on the marketplace alongside everything else, it would merely have been a choice, an option. And indeed, some did, but far too many that came from the outside entered into this hobby and others with no intent whatsoever to do so. They got into D&D because it was chic. The geek style so many people adopted as a fashion choice these last couple of decades. To them, the hobby was an accessory. But whilst they desired the label of geek and hobbyist, there were far too many parts of their new hobby that were way too embarrassing to bring up in the polite left-wing circles of intelligentsia that most of them either already frequented or aspired to be a part of. Imagining something was not an option to them, because this was not about their private enjoyment, it was about their public perception. It was never about going on a Dungeons and Dragons adventure. It was about showing off and fitting in. The precise opposite of the reason most people got into D&D in the first place previously. And so, of course, the hobby had to change. These new people were progressive, political, and very left-wing. D&D, meanwhile, was racist, sexist, and homophobic. All evil things. And so D&D itself was, of course, clearly evil. Wanting to not be evil, D&D then bent over backwards to every demand, removing evil racists, orcs are just silly little Mexicans now, rather than the societal, civilizational threat they are supposed to be, the outsider, the force that is anathema to the structured world of man, etc. And then D&D went on to remove races in general. And of course adding in things like magical wheelchairs, making dungeons handicap accessible. And societies filled, of course, by Californians. Because the new people did not want to, or were simply unable to imagine any new world, so they simply recreated our world. With dwarfs now of every race and every gender, working every job with no stereotypes. And of course, everyone in this new world is gay. To the point where the art piece that partially prompted this video, well, there is not a single straight pairing in the entire picture. It is in many ways the perfect example of the inclusivity the left has brought. In other words, the absolute exclusion of the overwhelming majority. And this is hardly some crazy exception. This particular art piece was part of a Pride-related merch sale. And the politics of the LGBTQIA+ is by now impossible to separate from D&D. A quick browse through their recent art reveals very few dragons, but a lot of strange, a lot of gay, and a lot of checkbox diversity of the most strident and ridiculous kind. This isn't merely what D&D is to the public now, it is what D&D is now. And I point out yet again that yes, you can imagine, you can pretend it's not, or well, maybe you can. Depends on which consent sheet you signed, I do suppose. But that is nothing more than cope. And a slow, gradual surrender as you abandon bastion after bastion. The thing you once knew as D&D has long since been taken away from you. And never, at any moment, not in a singular instance, did the people who took it away from you ever argue that maybe they should just imagine too, that some concession should be made for the traditional players. This is why coexistence is impossible. Impossible. You cannot have one side demanding for everything to be painted in their colors, for their flag to be raised up above all other things, and then have an opposition who simply says, oh well, I can just imagine that it would be different. This is not a compromise. This is not coexistence. This is not even tolerance. This is simply your extinction. And it is absolutely deliberate. The arguments made in defense of it are some of the dumbest I have ever seen. Quite literally, it is nothing more than pretending to not understand, of willful misinterpreting, ignorance as dense as tungsten retardation, used simply as an offensive mechanism. Like this one. No one is forcing your story to be woke, says the person with their allegiance proudly displayed in their name, commenting on an official piece of art for a campaign to sell Pride merchandise from the avowedly political company that owns, distributes, and makes Dungeons and Dragons. If this isn't forcing your stories to be woke, what, by the God Emperor's dangling testicles, could conceivably be? Forget once is happenstance, twice is coincidence, and thrice is enemy action, because we're so far down the line, we've long since lost count. Every level of this is loudly and proudly woke. And to pretend that it is all some simple, strange coincidence is the height of malicious obtuseness. Not to mention the condescending assumption that this is somehow fooling anyone. As if anyone can still believe that this isn't deliberate, that this still isn't being forced upon you. Or the usual excuse of, well, don't you know, D&D was always woke. And why? Well, because of bare-chested barbarians. As in, you see, they are, homoerotic, you must understand. Listen, the shirtless barbarian have been a staple trope since before we knew gay people existed. Okay, slight exaggeration, but the point is, from Conan to the original Berserker, meaning bare top, this has simply been a common part of the trope. And if you cannot look at an image like this without needing to touch yourself, that is very much so a you problem. Shared, fortunately, still by a vanishingly small minority of people. An unfortunately loud grouping of people, though, that has made it their mission to put their sexuality on everything. Including now also, as with everything else, another push into 40k. And I do love, again, how blatant it is. Which, again, brings me to my final point. They claim that the woke just want to be let in, right? That was the original argument, wasn't it? They just want to play the game too. They just want to be tolerated. Bro, can't we play the game as well? We're not going to get in the way, honest. It is patently and obviously absurd. This was never, demonstrably so, about any amount of equality. It was always about being put up above all others, to have their flags, their slogans, their worldview front and center. And not even that is truly enough, as they will not rest until it has fully replaced every facet of the thing that was once D&D, or 40k, or Star Wars, etc., as we can now again see so clearly with Dungeons and Dragons. That is why there can be no compromise. The opposition has already been fighting for total dominance and eradication from the start, because they never saw any value in what was there, only evil. And this impression of a sexist, bigoted, homophobic fanbase and hobby never wavered at any point, even as they were met at first with open arms and are still, absurdly enough, continued to be met with welcomes now. We continue to humor the argument even today that they just want to play. Yet, of course, no matter how much was surrendered, no matter how many compromises were made, the assault never ceased. And I want everyone to remember that. The next time you think, or anyone around you thinks, or put forward the thought that it doesn't really matter, it's just another piece of LGBTQIA plus artwork. It's just another piece of the old D&D universe removed. No worse than when they denounced Gygax, or removed races, or declared that the Dark Elves were just misunderstood. Because, surely, this time it will be enough, right? Just one more little sacrifice, just one more little thing to be handed over to the ravening wolf, and we'll be tolerant. We will finally be inclusive. After all, you can still always just pretend that none of this is happening.